Okay.
Okay, so we're recording. Shall I let everybody in since we're a minute too? Okay, good luck and thank you again.
Hello, everybody. I see people are coming in still. Got 29 people so far. Could I ask if you're not a speaker, you put yourself on mute, please, very kindly. "32 people, 33, numbers ticking up. Thank you all so much for joining us today. It's 1 o'clock, so I'm going to start these proceedings now. Thank you for joining us today. This is the Crisis Communications Network's second event of the year, and we are so excited with this particular lineup and this particular subject, which is an unusual subject. We haven't heard this discussed before, so very much looking forward to it. I'm not going to take up any of your time. I'm just going to say hello to you all and welcome you because I'm one of the co-chairs of the Crisis Communications Network. Just to remind you that if you're not a member of the network already, you can join up, and I urge you to do so via the CIPR's homepage. And I'd also urge you to keep an eye on our website. I'll put the web address in the chat box. Which has all the details of past events, upcoming events, and we write 2 blogs every month, and you'll find them there. So I don't want to take up your time. I'll hand you over to Rod and to Sarah, who are hosting today's event. Thank you all very much for joining us today, and hope to see you again at a future event.
Catherine, thank you very much. And as Catherine says, welcome to this, our, I think, second event. I'm just proving a man can multitask by talking while admitting people into the Zoom room. So today we are talking about the human imperative, safeguarding team well-being.
And what is the procedure?
Oh, if just go on mute if you're not a speaker, I think we've been muted. Good. Yes, the human imperative, safeguarding team well-being in a crisis. So anyone who has ever worked on a truly acute and sustained crisis will know that the link between the team's human preparedness going into the crisis and then their well-being, be it physical, physiological, psychological, or emotional, is a key driver of how effective the response is from both a crisis communications and a caregiving perspective. And that's why today we're looking at team well-being and caregiving from every angle, with an intentionally international and intentionally interdisciplinary panel from around the world. And we've assembled a team of panelists from across caregiving, psychology, and human performance, as I say, to explore this critical issue of team well-being and the link to crisis comms effectiveness. So I'll ask each of the panelists to briefly introduce themselves, then I'll talk a little bit about today's context and we'll dive in. I see Darlene is coughing, so Darlene, do you still want to go first?
It should be okay, thank you.
Good.
Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are across the globe. I'm Darlena Muhammad, and I'm deeply honored to be here with you this evening, and I see some familiar faces and names. It is rather ironic, or rather a bit touching for me today. We chose today of all days to be doing this. It is the 9th anniversary of the disappearance of MH370. And I think that would be a good time for us to be talking about 9 years on, how we've all fared. So a little bit about myself. I served with the Malaysian Airlines for 18 years. In that time, I served as a care team manager for 3 tragedies, not just MH370, MH17, but we also had another aircraft go down prior to that in October of 2013. So in that time, I've spent many years with the SAT team, training the people, doing simulations, in as much as I was also moving around different areas of the airline. I still remain a caregiver. I'm also affiliated to Go Crisis presently. As you can see, crisis is in my blood. So that's a little bit about me. Thank you very much, Rod.
Darlene, thank you. Nick.
Good morning, good evening. Hello, everybody. My name is Nick Proper. I'm the CEO of Impact Human Performance. We're an organization that focuses on delivering very kind of high impact training to elevate human performance, specifically in the areas of building human resiliency, optimizing human energy management, all with a view to helping people maintain performance in very challenging environments. So happy to be here and looking forward to the discussion.
Super, Nick, thank you. Nick, based in the US, Darlene is in Malaysia, and rounding out our truly global trot around the planet, Rob Stewart in Dubai.
That's all right, thank you, Rod. Hello, everyone. So I am a psychologist by trade. Initially, I was a counselling psychologist working in the UK with a private practice there, particularly around clinical counselling psychology. And then I transitioned into the business psychology world, into executive coaching and also into leadership development. I now work with organizations globally, looking at how they develop their people, but also how they care for them around well-being and culture as well. And it's great to be here. Thank you.
Rob, thank you. And then Sarah, my co-chair for today. Do you want to give just a very brief pen portrait?
Yes, hello everybody, welcome wherever you are. I am a member of the steering committee for Crisis Communications Network. I'm a former journalist. I'm also an experienced strategic communications consultant with a specialist interest in crisis communications. I'll be co-chairing today and will be facilitating the participant Q&A, which will come later. So if you do have questions, could you pop them in the chat or wait until we indicate we're ready for questions? Thank you.
Super, thank you. And then just to round it out, I'm special advisor to the network to declare an interest. I was part of an agency team of 4 flown into Kuala Lumpur 3 days after the disappearance of MH370 and worked with Darlene and also the chairman, CEO and board of the airline on the crisis communications following that disappearance and in the coming weeks and months. So have some direct experience of some of the things we're going to be discussing today. As Darlene has said, today is the 9th anniversary of MH370 disappearing, a mystery to this day as yet unsolved. 4 months and a few days before Malaysia Airlines MH17 was shot down over Ukraine by Russian separatists. So we felt it fitting and respectful to those whose lives were lost and their families to focus on dual tragedies in a short period of time, in a way that would also give Nick and Rob something very specific and real to talk about, because with all of our events, we try to make this as real, practical and grounded in reality as possible. What I would say is, given the nature of what we're discussing, I'd ask that we conduct today's session under the Chatham House rules, so no, if you like, public attribution of what is said. So I'm going to ask each of the panelists to make a short contribution. We'll then have a discussion of the issues falling out of that. And then Sarah has said she will run a participant Q&A. So Darlene, I mean, 10 minutes, not even vaguely enough to do vague justice to the experience that you had in 2013 and 2014. Yeah. But that notwithstanding, if you could give us a flavour of almost a compare and contrast of the experiences of caregiving for next of kin following the disappearance of an airline with 239 souls on board, and then of the shooting down months afterwards. So very different human experiences. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Rod. You're right. A lot to cover in 10 minutes. Let me just try and put it all in a nutshell. To have had one aircraft incident in an airline is devastating enough. You have two, something's very wrong, but to have three in the space of 10 months is really jarring to the organization, to its people, to its continuity. So the manner in which that we went through these three tragedies, and first and foremost, just like with any organization or airline, we have in place a crisis management, a risk management, a business continuity program that is run and well-oiled. We do regular trainings, we do simulations, we do tabletop exercises. But speaking from experience, no amount of training or manual perusal will prepare you for any of these, not just the three, just one. So, and this is one of the first things that I was quick to realize going into these three tragedies, namely the latter two. The amount of the amount of time we put and effort we put into developing manuals and policies and procedures. They are only good if we know them top to toe, back to front, inside out, at the tip of your fingertips prior to going into any kind of crisis. In a crisis, let me tell you, we did not have the luxury of going through page 4, paragraph 5, subsections. We had no time for that. But does that mean manuals are not useful? They are. They're very pertinent, but they need to be used and going in. And what we also learned very quickly was you need to revise it. When we were hit by the first tragedy in October 2013, we came back immediately and relooked. A lot of the stuff that we have in the manuals are ideal. Let me tell you, in a crisis, nothing is ideal. So we had to go realistic. We were in the midst of doing that, and we were hit by MH370. Again, unprecedented. In your manual, it says when you are deployed, you will be given a beautiful folder which has all the details you need, the family you'll be caring for, everything from down all the way down to their shoe size. Going into MH370, I only had a passenger manifest, nothing more. So that's your manual out the window. So again, it needs to be realistic, it needs to be revised. And while we were doing that, coming out of MH370, we were hit once again by MH17. So again, relearn, unlearn continuously. The other thing that I was quick to learn is that every crisis is a different beast. I'll talk about a bit more about that as we go along. So again, manuals are imperative, but they need to be well heeled prior to going to a crisis. Now, in comparison between the two, going into MH370, as I said, we had zero info, nothing, and that's all we had for the 3 months that the Family Assistance Center stayed open. Diligently, every single day, twice a day, at noon and at 3, we would meet with all the families and say the exact same thing. And to add salt to wound, when we arrived in Beijing, there was no Family Assistance Center set up as depicted in our beautiful manual. There was nothing there. So that was second assault. To land in a foreign country where you don't speak the language, past midnight in freezing cold temperatures, to be brought to a hotel laden with, overflowing with people who are angry, upset, and to have nothing there. So that alone was a double whammy of a crisis. So on board the aircraft, with very little to go on, I asked our team to do one of two things. One, to rest. In the 5-hour flight, to try and rest, because there is no telling when you would see rest again once we hit the ground. But of course, everyone's running on adrenaline and nobody listens to me. So everybody's very, very psyched. I know Nick and Rob will understand this fully. So I said, well, then find a buddy. Okay, get a buddy, especially one who speaks the language. We had 75 Searchy members, an NGO that speak the language. So I said, pair up and try and learn some simple phrases. Try and learn some cultural idiosyncrasies. Now, going into MH370, I thought, we don't speak the language. That would be the biggest barrier. As the days progressed, I realized language was just a tip of the iceberg. It's the culture that needs more attention, that is often overlooked, right? So these are the things. Now, coming into MH17, everything was laid out like a red carpet, because Netherlands, being a country that has victim aid, they take care of their own when a crisis like this happens. So when we arrived, the FAC was nicely done up, but no one was there because everybody was in the comfort of their home. Victim aid went out to them, so we were left redundant. And plus, we were public enemy number one. So that was a different battle. So in as much as I thought that the stellar team that I had in Beijing would be the superb team to take across with me to Amsterdam, I was terribly wrong. It was a totally different beast. In China, outward pouring of grief, very visible, very physical. In Amsterdam, very stoic, very quiet. So it needed different kinds of people. But more importantly, with my team, I am guilty of not taking care of them. Not enough provisions were made for them, in that we were sent out to care for other people's families. Their own well-being, their family's well-being were not being looked after, which then weighed heavily on them. Yeah, when you have your wife calling and said, the kids are asking for you, we're running out of groceries, da 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 da. So these were the things that I felt needs to go into the manual, which wasn't there to begin with. And as insurance dictates, each one of my caregivers had an individual room to themselves, a hotel room, which only worked for a while. Then I realized they're in a very high strung situation. You go home after a long day, you're utterly stressed. The last thing you need is to be on your own. So I quickly asked them to give up their rooms and share, which was not a popular decision among them. But after a while, they saw the value. People falling sick, and I didn't realize they were sick because they were alone in their rooms. So a lot of these things, and daily diffusion sessions. On the ride home from the FAC, we would do sing-alongs, anything just to switch off from the day. And it was well into a week before I had some psychologists come in to talk to the team. By that time, they were already running on empty, and they had just collapsed into a whole heap, crying because they did not know how to manage the situation. And I'm guilty of that, because we had not prepared for that. So there are a lot of things that goes on that is not something that we had pre-planned or considered going into a crisis. But yes, the leaders in a crisis as well, they're not necessarily the leaders you have on a regular day. They don't know how to operate under circumstances like these. And the major rule I had coming onto my team, you leave your rank at the door. It doesn't matter what rank you are on a regular day, we're all equals. And if we can't support each other, then we have a problem. And the main key word is resilience. Mentally, physically, psychologically, you need to be resilient. And as a team leader, I felt I was terribly inadequate because I didn't have all the answers. Pre-tragedies taught me you don't need to know all the answers. As long as you know to ask the right questions, the answers lie within. And most importantly, lead with your heart. When your heart is in the right place, everything else will fall into place. And this is the thing that the team carried with them. In all the days that went past, I asked them, why are you still here? You can easily go home. And their one true north was that if this were my family, if this was happening to me, all I'd want is for them to assist as much as I'm trying to assist right now. So there, I think that's on 10 minutes. I don't want to go over. We'll come back to that. So I hope that's helped. Thank you, Rod.
Brilliant. I've now done what I promised I wouldn't do, which is to get emotional with the memories of it. I mean, I think that before I pass to Nick, just to, two North Stars for me having been involved. One was the idea that as we said at the time, we traveled with hope but worked with reality. And I think that deal, in rugby, they say you play the man in front of you. You deal with the reality of what you are facing. And as Darlena said, one of our team said, there's no manual for this. And even if there was, we'd have to rip it up. So, Rob, we've talked about psychological safety. We've talked about group identity. And we've talked about growth mindset. Do you want to talk us through some of what you know from your work in clinical organizational behavioral psychology about what we can learn from the realm of psychology?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Rod. And thank you to Darlena as well. I think it was really moving. And there's a couple of things that I want to take from that as well. So I think the place I would start is actually similar to your last sentiment, Rod, about playing the man in front of you, dealing with what you have right here. But actually that points to what is so difficult about being a human being. And part of that is, even when we're here and now in the present, our brain can be in one of two places. And that can be a very much technical problem-solving mode or having that human focus. And that's what's particularly difficult for us. So when crisis hits, our natural tendency is to want to go into problem-solving mode and to fix and go, what can we do? What can we do? And let's face it, there is a certain element of that is absolutely required. The risk comes when not enough attention is then turned to what do our people need. And I think in crises for organizations, if they are thinking about people, they're thinking about the people that they're then dealing with, their customers, their clients, their patients, whoever that might be. And there's not enough focus on their employees and what they're going through. So one of the first things I'd say is that leaders have to have this dual focus. They have to have the ability to go, right, yes, what are we doing? But also, who are my people? They are people. They are human beings. And in the case that we're talking about now, it's even more imperative because they're going to be dealing with trauma. They're going to be dealing with grief that presents in a number of different ways. But what we need to be so careful about in situations where there's trauma is vicarious trauma, is where I start to experience traumatic symptoms, PTSD symptoms, because other people are. Now, when I was doing my clinical work, we had training to ensure that didn't happen to us. Your average employee does not have that. So they're working in these emotionally heightened situations and potentially taking on those feelings of other people. And if we're not careful, they're experiencing. And then we're going to have to deal with the trauma that they're facing as well. So to your point, a few ways that we can think about mediating some of this. And it really is mediating it. There's nothing we can solve in these highly emotional situations. People are people, they're going to feel those emotions, but bringing that threat level down to something reasonable. And the reason we need to do that is so people can function. Like, that may sound cold-hearted, but actually our people need to function in these crises. They need to use their brains. And what we know from threat responses neurologically is they limit the amount we can use our frontal cortex to make logical, rational decisions or to perspective take and be empathic to the people that we're speaking to. So really important that we think about how can we minimize that. So just three things I want to touch on now. One of the first ones is a group identity. As human beings, we're social creatures, we're mammals, we like to work together in small groups. That's fantastic. When we don't necessarily have depth of relationship, what can be really important for us is an identity. We are here to do this. We're here to solve this problem. And in situations like this, it's about making that really explicit. I'm not saying establish it there and then, because that's probably too late at that point, but have your group reiterate, make explicit, why are we here? What is our purpose? To Darlena's point, if this was your family, what would you need? That is a great way for a leader to go, why are we here, folks? I know we're going into this and all this uncertainty, so ground yourself in Why are we doing this? That's our group identity. And suddenly we're more able to collaborate with the people around us, empathize, perspective take. It'll help us problem solve any of the challenges we're going to face too. Second part I'd say is around psychological safety. So this is people's ability to share mistakes and concerns and ideas around them to the group and their leaders. Now, again, not something that's reactive. If you don't have this already as a leader, you won't suddenly get it in a crisis. So it's about putting in the work before that happens. But then it's about going, tell me what you think and how we can solve this, because otherwise it's all on your shoulders as a leader. Plus, when you do that for people and they have the autonomy to share with you, that mediates stress as well. The more autonomy we have, the more we produce serotonin and endorphins. That's going to help us mediate cortisol, which is our stress hormone. And then finally, the thing I'd say is around growth mindset. Now, this may sound conceited, so please bear with me. Growth mindset is not going, where's the positive? It's not about positive thinking. It's about going, we need to function and we need to use this as an opportunity to learn. A growth mindset will make you go, how can we do the best we can here in a difficult situation? But what have I done before and how have I managed it? What skills do I already have? How can I use this as an opportunity to come together with people and learn and use their experiences? Because the opposite of that is a fixed mindset where we go, we have to do this. And that's too limiting in a crisis. That's not going to help anyone, particularly where things like collaboration is involved. So I think those are the three elements. I'm aware of time, don't want to take up other people's. That's how they can be useful. But really important here is they can't be reactive. It must be something that leaders are doing every day and then making more explicit when it comes to a crisis and then utilizing it that way.
Rob, superb and succinct. Thank you. And just before I hand over to Nick, I mean, just one observation again from the front line is, as an agency team of 4, we, to your point about role attribution, we simply worked out who was going to be doing what without making it explicit because we didn't need to. We just knew intuitively who was the strategist, who was the writer, who was the planner, and it just worked. And to your point about psychological safety, there were times when, people were so exhausted, just like, it's 3 a.m, you've got to go to bed. You're from New York, you've got 13 hours of jet lag, you are no use. You go to bed, sleep, pick it up when you're able. So I think that thing, to Darlena's point about leaving ego at the door, leaving hierarchy at the door, you've got a job to do and you do it as a team. And I know that sounds a bit glib, but it's so true. Nick, your website says you help organizations replace uncertainty with purpose, fatigue with energy, and fear with resilience. Translate that into this sort of very human experience for us.
Yeah, thanks, Rod. Yeah, thank you. And firstly, Darlena, wow, what an amazing kind of introduction, and Rob just speaking such true and wise words there. So firstly, thanks for having me. I've already learned about 15 important things this morning. About is avoiding this retrospective storytelling of how damaging that was for our people. I know that going into these things, like Darlena was saying, we have the manuals, we have the process, we have the roles, so we have all of these things, but what we haven't done almost always in advance is actually train our people as human beings, to Rob's point. How are we going to handle the madness that is coming our way? And importantly with that as well is training them on very unstable platforms. One of the challenges, even when organizations, and we work extensively in the military and the intelligence agency community, and of course, right across the corporate environment, is when training does happen to sort of prepare our humans for these challenging environments, the training all happens in very stable environments, right? It happens on stable platforms, which is great in the moment because we build this confidence of, yeah, we know what to do in this difficult situation. We'll kind of do A, B, and C. And to Darlena's point, when it actually happens, you're suddenly upside down, moving at 100 miles an hour. So you have to actually train your people in equally unstable environments. So they do just switch into an operational mode, even when things are not going as planned. Back to sort of the individual perspective on Rob's point about group identity going in, the other thing that's very important, and our starting point would be, We have to make sure all the individuals involved in this response know what good looks like for them as a human being. It sounds sort of simple and obvious, but inevitably, even in normal times, people are running so quickly that we get very transactional. We really forget about, how do I want to try to regulate myself so that I can bring my best into these moments that matter throughout the day? That might be with colleagues in a crisis, that might be with a call to the family at the end of the day when you're trying to decompress. But you have to know what are the best self characteristics for you that really going to leverage some skills in order to bring forward perhaps just a couple more minutes every day. That's actually how we really maintain performance edge, which is critical in these crisis situations. So who are you when you're operating at your best? And then understanding from our perspective, there are two things that get in the way of you being at your best. Number one is, we never really trained anyone how to optimize their response to stress. You know, Rob just articulated it absolutely beautifully, which is, you know, we have to train people how to not avoid stress. So much of the literature that we've all grown up on is, you really better avoid stress, or you can have bad outcomes. That turns out to be impossible in normal times, and of course, absolutely impossible in a crisis. So we need to train people how to respond optimally to the inevitable discomfort that's coming their way, both in the heat of the moment. So that's, like Rob was saying, kind of reducing the threat response and allowing people to hold on to that cognitive flexibility in these unbelievably difficult. And sometimes a good decision is maybe just saying nothing and listening really well. It's not all about making a lot of noise. And the other is, we need to make sure that they've lightened the load of what we call their always on stresses as they go in to a crisis. Because Darlena's point of, you know, it's hard enough dealing with what we're dealing with in front of us, and now we've also got things that we didn't have a good handle on before we left home. Now they're starting to weigh disproportionately on our shoulders. So how do we lighten the load of how we carry these always on stresses so that we are as focused as we can be on the things that matter? And then the second part of kind of the discussion around what knocks us off our path in terms of being at our best is simply the lack of recovery. And I think everyone's talked about this. Recovery, even on in a normal organization for a normal team, is seen as this future-based endeavor. And what I mean by that is, you hear yourself and you hear your colleagues say things like, in 6 weeks' time, I'm going to take 2 days vacation. Hopefully everything's going to work out just fine. And of course, that's not what happens. It's not enough. And even particularly in a crisis environment where you're working essentially round the clock until your system just shuts you down and you have to sort of fall asleep, that's still waiting too long for the recovery to come. Recovery needs to be embedded in what you're doing moment by moment, hour by hour through the crisis. And the mistake people make is we think recovery takes a lot of time. We think it's a good night's sleep. We think it's, 3 or 4 hours of quiet in the evening. It doesn't have to be. And actually what we need is just perhaps 60 seconds or 2 to 3 minutes, but we have to be intentional. We have to know what works for us. And we have to have the discipline of leaning into that recovery, even when the temptation is to say, I got to keep going. Actually, as everyone's articulated perfectly, you very quickly become no use to anybody if you're not paying attention to your recovery. And the final comment really is what I've just described is the system by which we build human resiliency. Knowing what we're fighting for as an individual in terms of being at our best, learning to optimize our response to stress, which is the inevitable discomfort that we're going to be dealing with, and then recovering quickly and in real time from that stress to metabolize it and leverage that discomfort as an opportunity to grow. And if we can do that in these challenging environments, we can just be at our best a little bit more often every day, which is probably where some of the most important work happens in these very challenging environments. So that would be my take on the situation.
Nick, fantastic. I want to ask a couple of questions of the panel, then I want to make sure that Sarah has plenty of time to run a participant Q&A as well. When I do leadership training, I always say that while it's lovely to be inspired by Martin Luther King or Mahatma Gandhi, actually the greatest lessons are from your shittiest leaders, forgive my French. So while we've talked about the positive lessons, I'm interested in your respective views of are there easy mistakes to make? I mean, I'll give you just one or two from my perspective. I won't name my employer at the time, but the words "Are you okay?" were never issued before, during, or after. Turned out the two of the four of us weren't in time. And the second thing was having the CFO on the phone going, "I need you to stand the team down because the contract hasn't been signed." Well, guess what? The only person who can sign the contract is the CEO. He's a bit busy at the moment, and so are we. So fire me if you wish, but I've got work to do. Hung up. One of my ballsier moments, don't regret it. Mistakes that organizations and leaders make in these situations. Any of you, the floor is yours again.
If I may quickly, the role of the Go team lead in any crisis initially in the manual was pegged to a position. And we found out really quickly that that didn't work. So we quickly changed it real time, that in an event of a crisis or tragedy, the right person will be put in for that job, regardless of rank. That was one. The other thing that we also found in terms of leadership we failed is that we were deemed heroes to be out on the front line, fighting fire and taking care of people. And yet they were the unsung heroes at home, carrying our burden, business as usual. Now, these staff members were not being updated on what's going on the war front. They were just like, just sit in the corner and just keep tinkering away at the laptop, when they could have also been used as our advocates as well. They could have been our ambassadors as well. At the very least, their emotional turmoil would have been addressed. And yet that was not addressed. So that's something I think, something to consider as well from our end. Over to you.
If I could add to that, because I think it's a really prevalent point, and it ties in with what Nick also mentioned about psychological flexibility. Part of the human condition is that when stress elevates, we become quite binocular in vision. And I mean that literally and sort of metaphorically as well. So literally, so we could hunt and we could see things on the horizon, but also our brain narrows in its focus because it thinks it needs more resource on one thing. And so, to Darlena's point there, leaders becoming focused on, I'm here right now in this location around me, and that's where all of my effort is required, and not taking the time to think flexibly about who else is involved and what's needed. And of course, that's difficult for a leader, but leadership is difficult. That's the point in being a leader, is it's that position where you do have to have all these considerations. But similar to what Nick said, is in those highly stressed situations, psychological flexibility minimizes, and we are unable to really problem solve well. Best example I can give anyone here, and I'm sure it resonates, is if anyone thinks about those times they've been worried about something in the back of their mind, and they're trying to read a book or an article, and they read and get down to the bottom and think, I haven't read any of that. And you go to the top and you start again. I'm sure we've all had that. That is your brain losing its ability to function and be flexible because there's a concern that's narrowing our focus.
Yeah, and I think just, again, very, very salient points. That I suppose to a certain degree an eternal optimist. And so I think leaders sort of really want to get it right. And the one thing we see in our work is these topics around how are you doing? How stressful is this? Are you getting enough recovery? They're actually terrifying, even for the most seasoned leaders, to open the lid, because they don't feel like they are equipped to then deal with what the answer might be. And so their system's just saying, like, don't go there. They're probably, as a human, thinking I really need to go there, but they're also defaulting to the hierarchy and the corporate sort of vision of, we've just got to kind of focus on the business here. And so what we talk about, which I think is very important, is establishing like a narrative, a language that you can use to talk about these very difficult things. Even when we start talking about optimizing, our management of stress, the role of intentional recovery, what we see in the businesses where we're embedded, it's like very regularly people will turn around. They might not say, are you okay? They might say, hey, how, where is your recovery coming in the next 4 or 5 hours? you've just been through a disproportionately stressful thing. What's the plan to just make sure that you're allowing a little bit of time to process it? So find a language that is acceptable and everyone kind of understands what it is. Then I think more leaders will be perhaps a bit more comfortable to just not ask open-ended questions, but to at least say, I know you have to focus on your recovery right now.
That's a brilliant point about language. I'm going to ask just one more question and then throw it open to the floor, and Sarah will run that. Around language, I thought in a question about expectation management, both internal and external. So when I headed to Heathrow on day 3 of MH370, having absolutely no idea what we were going into, if I had any vague capability of adding anything to the collective effort. And my wife, sorry, tearing up again, my wife said to me something that was my North Star through the whole thing, which is, this will only ever be degrees of bad. In other words, as long as a Boeing 737 with 239 souls on board remains missing, and, best case, you find it, none of this is ever going to be good. So I wonder whether, as communicators, we're almost programmed to promote good news, to promote the upside, to promote the positive outcome, when in reality, this was only ever going to be degrees of bad. And therefore, in terms of our own self-management, in terms of media management, Darlena, I'm sure it was a sort of North Star for you. What role is there for expectation management, I guess, is my deeply rambling and slightly over emotive question.
Don't get me started, Rod. Okay. Media, we just did totally clear of it. We had a stellar media team, short-handed as they were, but we just stayed clear. The team were also amazing in that they didn't speak to the media or allude anything based on their body language or anything like that. But we did have trouble with family members who were quite happy to tell all and have the media spotlight. But I think that was partly their shock and also denial and all those different phases going in. So in terms of media, I think as you can see, if all the videos and clips that's been showed, we were totally sealed off. The media were on the other side of the wall, and tried as they may to get in, they were not able. Assistance center in Beijing, but that was not so true here in Kuala Lumpur, as you can also see again in all that. So in that respect, we were quite saved from the agony of having to face the media. I don't know if I answered that question, but yeah.
You did indeed. By the way, if anyone thinks that Kay Burley's been unethical recently, you should have seen her in KL. Anyway, Nick, Rob, thoughts on expectation management?
Yeah, I think incredibly important. I mentioned psychological safety earlier. Now, psychological safety in more of a commercial business sense, part of what we do with that is called setting the frame. So I've got a project coming up and I'm going to set the frame. I'm going to tell you what to expect. That gives you some certainty, and that means you can be more autonomous when you get there. Now, this might seem like a different scenario, but actually it's not, because if we don't manage those expectations, people will run away. Their imaginations will run away themselves, causing more stress. So as harsh as it might sound, actually sitting with your people and saying, this is going to be awful. People are going to scream at you. They are going to blame you. They are going to wish it upon you and your family. Like, that may sound heartless to say to our people, but it prepares them. And there's this fine balance between overburdening people and setting the worst case scenario and informing them so they're realistic. And I think that's a real struggle. To Nick's point, leaders absolutely, in general, want to do the right thing, but they're not trained to ask that "how are you" question in a deep crisis and know how to respond. And they're also not trained to know where that fine balance is between informing and totally panicking their people.
Yeah, and just to round it out, the framework that Rob's referring to, I kind of really like that insight, and you can see how important it is as Darlena describes, what it's like, even just through the lens of the media frenzy. This is kind of comes back to this idea of best self, like who are you when at your best? So the simplest way that we train people who are in these extraordinary environments is three words that you recognize, three emotions and behaviors that underpin you when you are having more of a positive impact in a situation than not. So for example, what I've learned over the many years doing this work is, for me, it's patience, focus, and empathy. Those three words are my expectation and framework, whether I'm doing something like this, in my work, whether I'm sitting down with one of my kids, whether I'm thinking about is, if I can hang on to and use some of the systems that we know are out there to hold on to perhaps a little 5 seconds of empathy and just stay focused for the next 2 minutes, I'm going to just probably have a slightly better outcome than not. This is not about perfection. This is recognizing that there will be plenty of times when patience, empathy, and focus completely go out of the window. But if you know that that's what you're sort of trying to get back to at all times, that's a very simple, very personal framework for expectations that I think avoids the fear of looking into into the sort of the noise and the frantic picture in front of you, and just allows you to come back and say, just hold on to any variation of those three characteristics stepping into this next moment of madness, and I'm more than likely to produce a slightly improved outcome than if I didn't do that little moment of reflection.
Wonderful, Nick. Thank you. I see we've got questions starting to come in. So, Sarah, I'll hand over to you to start fielding those questions for the panel. If that's okay.
Yeah, thank you, Rod. I just want to first of all thank the panel, as I'm sure everybody else participating does, for the very honest insights from the midst of terrible crises, and for those professional perspectives on how to prepare better for these events that frankly no one ever wants to see happen. So if we move to the next section, this is the opportunity for the participants to pose their questions and for the panel to share further insights. We have 53 participants on the call today. And what I'm going to do is switch between the hands raised and people who have chosen to put a question in the chat. And there is a question from Chloe Chesko. I don't know if you want to voice your question, Chloe, or if you'd rather I read it out for you. Busy office, she says. Okay, so Chloe's question is, in a situation like MH370, where the crisis hasn't really ended as it's still a mystery, how do you prepare people to deal with the unknown? And she comments, it's not like as if you've been able to put it to bed. And that's an excellent first question. Thank you, Chloe. Who on the panel would like to start with a response to Chloe?
May I start the ball rolling?
Please do.
In the case of MH370, when you had nothing, I had nothing on day one, I still have nothing 9 years on. But the one thing that we found the day we had to close down all the family assistance centers, the family who were initially very angry became very scared that we were going to forget about them. But what we did do for years, I'm not able to recall how many years, but for years we would send envoys and our team would keep going back to Beijing to meet with the families on a monthly basis with our legal people to say, again, the same things. But we kept doing this for years to, if nothing else, to assure them that whatever theories or stories you're hearing out there, the truth would come from us. If there was anything, we would be the one sharing it with you. So we kept going on doing this. It may have helped in a little small way for them to know that we've not abandoned them. That we're not just going to let it go. It's been enough time, so we're going to let you go. So that was the one thing. I mean, it definitely hasn't been put to bed. And even now, there's still a lot of questions going out there.
Yeah, if I could I just add a couple of thoughts on that in terms of the real time comms and particularly the media management. I mean, Darlene has highlighted the first of 2 or 3 fundamental guiding principles that we agreed. One of them was that the families will hear news from the airline first. They will never, ever hear anything through the news media, simple as. And the second was, I don't know how to put this, we'll deal with realistic requests. So CNN, would you like to field a spokesperson for a panel we're holding on whether the aircraft has been taken away by aliens? No, obviously we wouldn't like to do that. Would you like to lend us a plane so that we can recreate the early hours of the flight and perhaps put a member of your management team on board to narrate those early hours? Sorry, would you like us to be complicit in recreating the early hours of the likely deaths of 239 people? No, we wouldn't. So I think that knowing with absolute iron certainty what your guiding principles were, that when you're dealing with zero information, a taxi driver on the way back from Heathrow at one point said, nature abhors a vacuum and people abhor a lack of information. We had none, and therefore all you can have is North Star guiding principles.
Yeah, and I'll just sort of jump in. It's the specific question here, and I'm sure Rob could add much more clarity than the way I'm going to describe this. But honestly, whether it's something of this magnitude or even just we call them these open loops, right? When at the end of the day, if you like, or at the end of a period of time or a project, we all have these open sort of psychological loops just rolling, and we do need to try to just close them down, particularly as it relates to on a day-to-day basis. If we're going to go to bed and try to get some restful sleep, we're not going to have everything done. This is not about having everything sorted and you have a plan. It is about saying, today is now done, right? Today or this period is just now done. And you just sort of give yourself permission to say, I'm going to pick it up again tomorrow at 6 in the morning, but right now, there is nothing more I'm going to do on this, and I need to provide myself with the opportunity to recharge. And I think the question is asking on this sort of mass scale. I'm thinking about it more kind of day to day. If you're experiencing this, you have to give yourself permission just to close the loops. And sometimes that's just as simple as writing down the things that you're still worried about before you get into bed, because you kind of get them out of your head, you get them onto paper, and right, I'll just pick that up in the morning. So some simple things like this just allow a moment of relief and recovery, which in the kind of duration of some of these issues that people are dealing with is crucial.
Yeah, I would totally agree with what Nick just said there from a clinical perspective as well. Absolutely. And the final thing I'd add is, and this is always some of the hardest clinical work I did, was working with people who had lost a loved one in that they'd maybe disappeared or been kidnapped. And they were like, I just want answers, Rob. And they were never going to find those answers, and that uncertainty would just eat them up. What we can look to is, some key human needs in this. And I think one of them is certainty. Now, they're looking for certainty, but you can't provide it in that way. So what can you provide? And to Rod's point, a North Star of what we're going to do, that's some certainty. What other certainty can you give them? Even if it's down to tomorrow, I'm going to do this, or I'm going to talk about this, or, cover this topic. I think the autonomy is really key. What can you do? Like, yes, a certainty of what it might be, but also what can you do in this? People want to feel like they're doing something. And finally, the relatedness, the connection with other people. We're social creatures. So that's why so often when people have gone missing, we connect them with groups, and they can, or, grieving groups, but people they can connect with. And that goes some way to mediate it, but not necessarily solve it. And that's what's so hard.
Thank you very much. Thank you, panelists, for really great responses to that excellent question. We have another question from Sarah Sharp, who's raised a hand. Sarah, would you like to share your question with the panel, please?
Hello. So my team, we work in policing, so a lot of our media officers will have contact with the families of missing people, murdered people involved in major incidents. So it's quite often a scenario where we have to try and get people to take time off, take that recovery time. And I was just interested in any tips from the panel, because we do also have the point where our media officers will be sharing their empathy with the families and taking on some of their stress as well. They don't want to leave things at the door, and it's really hard to get people to say, take that time, hand over to somebody else. Really hard to get people to do that. But also I was really interested in what was said around optimizing response to stress, and whether you also had any tips around or any advice where to go find more information about how we can help people and their responses as well.
Yeah,
Thank
I'm
you,
happy to
Sarah. That's an excellent question.
Rob,
Could
you
I
go?
invite perhaps Nick? Yes, yeah. It seems like you're back, Nick.
Yeah, I think there's sort of two parts to the question. One is this idea of when we associate kind of stepping away or taking some recovery as a long period of time, that really plays into people's concerns around kind of dropping the ball or not being there or not being present or letting their team down. We tell ourselves such powerful emotional stories about why I know I probably should take a little bit of a break, but that's absolutely the wrong thing to do for a whole number of reasons right now. So I think the starting point, and we see this is the classic, when a leader says to their business, make sure you take your holidays, make sure you take your vacation. Everyone's like, yeah, fine, but they never do. That's because they're telling themselves very compelling stories as to why that's not a good idea. So rather than starting with that difficult, go and take 5 days off, if we come back and say, I want you to try to find every hour 60 seconds that you're going to just take for yourself to do something that allows you to just reset, kind of metabolize that discomfort, just have a moment of pause. It could be as simple as getting outside, going for a walk, getting some fuel into the system. This is another issue we see constantly. People in crisis are chasing their fueling all the time, and we forget how much fuel the brain needs just to make difficult decisions. Or it might be just texting a loved one, or it might be writing a quick journal. These small moments of recovery are much more realistic and acceptable to people who don't want to put the job down. Make all the difference, because we start to create this virtuous circle of building the resiliency system. So I think, aim low. Candidly, I spend my whole life talking to senior people going, your problem is you're all overachievers. You don't know how to aim low with some of these small changes. And then when it comes to stress response, I think I just go back to Rob's comment around one of the things we talk about, this challenge response. This is like in the heat of the moment. The brain doesn't know the difference between a true life or death situation or not. We literally have to override it and say, this isn't life or death, it's just a challenge that I more than likely have the capacity to step up and meet. And that's where we use a simple technique called emotional labeling. Literally, what are you feeling right now? The answer might be furious, overwhelmed, terrified. But when we ask the brain that question, what am I feeling right now? It forces an interruption of the rollout of stress response, and has people and basically has the body just focus on answering the question. So it allows you to hold this cognitive flexibility to make good decisions in the heat of the moment. So this is all in the area of emotional labeling. It's in the research is all called challenge response. I hope you can still hear me. My challenge response is kicking in right now. So moment to moment, small, fast recovery modalities, and then training people in this idea of just, some of our clients call it name it to tame it. When you feel that emotion, put a name to it. That just allows the body to do what it will naturally do and regulate you to handle that situation a little bit more effectively.
And if I could just quickly build on that, Sarah, fantastic question. And when I was doing my clinical work, I used to work a lot with the armed forces and with the police as well. And they have their own services like combat stress, and I can't for the life of me think of the police one. But my best advice I can give you here is think about actually the culture behind seeking help, because that is the biggest issue with all of this in the armed forces, in the police, in any emergency services, NHS as well. It's, are people willing to take the services? They're there, but there's this endemic perception that by doing that, you are somehow incompetent or weak. And if that doesn't change, we simply won't see the uptake of those services. And that, bottom line, is leadership. And it's modeling those behaviors and delivering those messages and living up to that.
And if I may just add a very super quick, slightly flippant point to Nick's point about small wins, we had one night off in 3 weeks. Lychee Martini will be with me forever. And it breaks the cycle. You just need something that isn't the same cycle of exhaustion. And if it can have a bit of fun involved, albeit with respect for what's going on, it made all the difference. Little wins.
So thank you very much. For those who can stay on a little while longer, there is an excellent final question, though there may be more. Sorry, I just need to scroll back up in the chat. 1 second. So yeah, it's from David Schlee. I hope I've pronounced that correctly. David says that it's a thoughtful and powerful discussion, and he makes a very, very good point. And I'm afraid I'm going to land this one on you, Rod. I hope you don't mind. He asks the question: does CIPR need to take more leadership in getting organisations to embed the human approach to processes?
I mean, the slightly glib answer to that is I think we all do. I mean, this is not an advert. My entire business is based on the idea of human preparedness, organizational resilience, and business performance. In other words, you can have all the systems and processes and infrastructure and manuals in the world, unless you are prepared at an individual and team level from a human perspective, they are just systems and processes. So I think there's an increasing, the reason we call today's session the human imperative is that ultimately it's about the human. And I think that should CIPR doing more? I mean, I think the fact that we're holding this discussion, I would view as a small act of leadership. Collectively, I can't talk for the leadership of the industry body, but I don't think any more discussions like this would be a bad thing. Did I just PR myself? Sorry for that.
I have to say, I think something that I think would serve clients extremely well, and for those of us who work with directly in-house, I think it would serve organisations very well, and not least particularly serve individuals very well who are in those difficult situations. My own view is, as a journalist who worked on many high-profile, difficult, emotional crisis stories, I concur. But perhaps that's one we can take away from this and feed back to CIPR as a good point. I can't see any more hands or questions. If anyone is absolutely desperate to ask a final question, please do raise your hand now. Otherwise, I'm going to be handing back to Rod to wrap up the session. So no more hands, Rod. All yours.
Thank you for all the superb questions. I mean, how do I wrap up? I'm not even going to try. There's too much brilliant content in there. I think we end where we started, which is with the human. Darlene going to sum up the whole session for us.
Sorry, there's a question in the chat group from Binu Jacob.
Sarah. Oh, there's one last one, isn't there? I just saw that popped in. Sorry, just Rod. As I said the momentous words. No more questions. I'm just going to come to that one. Sorry, Rod, for interrupting there. There is from Binu Jacob. I hope I've pronounced that correctly, Binu. As a leader, how does one reconcile with the self when a crisis, POA, goes off kilter and weighs heavily on the mind? In some instances, sorry may not be enough. Is that something you want to pick up on, Darlene? I feel like it's resonating particularly, or we can hand off to maybe the psychologist for a view on that. Yeah. So,
all yours,
Rob, would you like to pick up?
Yeah, absolutely. More of people's time, so I'll keep it short. I think it's really about focusing on an internal locus of control and going, what do I feel like I can do in this situation? What impact can I have? And I know that sounds like a bit of a cop-out, but it is going from a place of where leadership is about delivering targets and, performance to going in these scenarios. It is really just about minimizing the pain as much as I can. And if it means by, providing some of Rod's updates that this is how we're going to approach this to a family member, and giving them some solace by doing that, like maybe that's enough. And if that's not enough, maybe it's just about checking in one of your team members and going, are you okay? Do you want to talk? That sometimes is all we can get, because as you say, sorry is just not going to be enough for us. So it's what are the small things in real crises that can really make a difference?
To not disappoint Sarah, you know, I am guilty of this. I have a lot of this 9 years on. A lot of it still weighs on my mind. Although I don't cry as much as Rod does outwardly. But there's this guilt towards the team, the guilt towards the people you are not able to have answers for. You carry that guilt. So maybe I need to go to Dubai and have a session with Rob and see how he and Nick can fix what's going on in here. But also there's that stigma, I think, in our culture, that seeing a therapist or talking to a counselor means there's something definitely wrong with you. And even now, I was just talking to Rod before we came on live. We were talking to my team today on the 9th anniversary, and a lot of them saying we're suffering PSTD, and that weighs on me. I feel that as a leader, I've not done enough to help them, where really it's on each individual to go and seek the help that is readily available for them, and that it shouldn't be carrying this burden all this time. So we heal in different ways, and this is one of way talking to people, so it helps. So thank you, Bina, for asking that question.
Thank you. Thank you for an excellent question. And again, handing back now to Rod to wrap up.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'll so my first attempt at wrap up was the human bit, which is we did what we said on the tin, which is talk about the human imperative. I think as well, I mean, you know, I describe my own experience of working on MH370 as an impossible privilege. It is solemn work. We owe it to ourselves and our teams to do this stuff and do it well, so that we can be as effective as we possibly can, you know, to respect those who were lost and the families. And I just think for me, the interdisciplinary nature of today's discussion reminds me why comms needs to open itself up beyond its own natural boundaries. So Darlene and Nick, Rob, you up for writing a book? I'll do an abstract and off we go. Seriously, thank you to each and every one of you. Thank you for staying on, for those who have. It's been absolutely fascinating. I learn something new every time I discuss this topic. Go forth and look after your teams and look after yourselves. Thank you for joining today.
Thank you, folks.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.